course, of course. Hi, how are you?
Nice to see you.
Nice to meet you in person. Never in person.
Never. We've crossed paths in the hall once.
Yeah.
So
Always like Zoom and everything else.
It's so nice to see you. Did you just arrive today?
No, I got in yesterday.
Oh yeah. Okay, good.
Mind you, it was a train that was supposed to take 4 hours that took almost 6.
I think Via's off. I did that recently. I was taking the train to Toronto, and we were supposed to get in at 10:30, and I think it was like 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was beside myself.
Well, I'm kind of nervous about tomorrow because tomorrow is the beginning of the Eras tour in Toronto at Union Station. And that's where, and I'm coming in, I'm supposed to be in at 5, but if it's like an hour late, like I'm in that zoo.
You're in the zoo
with the
regardless.
stuff.
I feel like it's probably.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit nervous about going
We need to
home.
have reports from you.
Like it's gonna be it's gonna be so horrible. Yeah, yeah, and it's not just that because they've also shut down, like they've shut down the streets, like in and around.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I'm just going into the subway, but I'm gonna have to navigate.
I
I know. I'm so nervous about that, but it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah, and this is an epic takeover of the city.
Yeah,
Right?
6 days.
So my daughter is expecting, and she's like, "Can we go?" I'm like, "No." And then I didn't even try to get the tickets. So like,
I mean, there was one story of someone, they paid $12,000 for tickets, and then it was like a scam. It's like, well, why are you doing? Like, what are you thinking? Like, you don't even have that money, probably. It's just so dumb. Like, it's not worth it. Yeah, but it is what it is. I'm here now. I hope
stay longer.
I hope this is absorbed. It's just a lot of information. So I hope.
Is it the first time you're talking about it?
Yeah, I wrote this just for this. I wrote this like 3 weeks ago. Yeah. Sure. No. I'll stand throughout. Yeah. So if you want to talk to the mic, yeah. I'm only gonna sit through the Q&A.
Okay, good. Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second of 4 lectures for the Shannon Lecture Series of 2024. I will do a small introduction and then things will start in earnest. So I'm a history prof at Carleton and the chair of the endowment fund that gives us these series. That we have a virtual audience, and thank you very much for those who came face to face. Please help yourself with food and drink during or after, and please make sure that your name is in the draw for the Pass for Ingenium at the end, and we are entering also all the virtual people in the draw, and we'll announce it at the end. The Shannon Lectures were created more than 2 decades ago by donor Lois Long, who passed away a few years ago, who was a friend of the history department, wanted to do something about Canadian and social history. And with the help of her dear friend, Bruce Elliott, who is a retired member of our department and a historian of migrations from the British Isles to Canada, they decided on this form, an annual fancy lecture series on Canadian social history. A part of that fund is also used for, in our department, to fund some graduate student scholarships and some graduate student travels. So it's important for us every time to thank her. She was a regular attendee of these lectures for years. We also want to thank the James Miller, the director of our department, who is online with us today, and the staff of the department who have been very helpful in putting all this together. The convener this year is Alexa Lepera. You will see her in a minute. She's an assistant curator at Ingenium, and she is a historian of Black Canadian history in general, public historian, and technology in particular. What we're going to do tonight is Alexa will speak a little to introduce the theme and our speaker. Then our speaker will speak for about an hour, and then we'll have 25 minutes to half an hour of Q&A, and we will alternate between the room and the virtual audience. And if you stay, even if you don't stay to the end, we'll inform you by email if we won our draw. I thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and Alexa, it's up to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dominique, for a great introduction. As she said, I'm Alexa LaPera. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Assistant Curator, Domestic Environments and Social Diversity at Ingenium. I have light brown skin, short curly hair, I'm wearing glasses, and a fuzzy black sweater today. Before we begin, I wanted to acknowledge that the work that I do is on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people who have lived on this land since time immemorial. And as I consider the theme of this lecture series, I find it important to, seems like we might have lost.
No,
that was
no.
me,
Yep.
all me and my feet.
Watch the chords, watch the chords.
I'll stand back here.
Yep,
As I was saying, as I consider sort of the theme of this lecture series, I find it important to speak to how slavery and its afterlives and histories of settler colonialism are intertwined and endure in our present day life. When I started working at Ingenium back in 2022 as part of my practicum as a graduate student at Carleton, I was looking for connection in the Ingenium collection between Black histories and science and technology. And back then it felt that perhaps that no one was doing this work at this specific intersection. And of course that is not true. I think the amazing slate of speakers for this series is a testament to that in fact these histories are perhaps integral to each other. And I want to say thank you to everyone who accepted the invitation to present, of course including Dr. Cheryl Thompson this evening, and thank you to folks who attended our first session in October virtually with the very first fellowship students from Ingenium's Black and African Canadian Scientific and Technological Innovations Fellowship. The speakers for this series understand technology in broad terms, ranging from physical tools and scientific instruments to methodological practice and critical intervention. They offer critical insight into anti-Black racism's relationship with technology and how technology has enabled or enables Black resistance, community building, and liberation. And in broad terms, these lectures asked us to seriously consider the fluidity that exists between technology, society, and ourselves, and perhaps to question our sometimes very linear understanding of science, technology, and innovation. With that, it's a great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Thompson. Dr. Thompson is an associate professor in performance at the Creative School. She hates doing introductions, but I'll speak a little bit at length. At the Toronto Metropolitan University, where she teaches performance history courses. She is the author of Uncle, Race, Nostalgia, and the Politics of Loyalty, and one of my personal favorites, Beauty in the Box, Detangling the Roots of Canada's Black Beauty Culture. And upcoming next year in 2025, so everyone keep a lookout, Blackface Atlantic, Performing Slavery, Conflict, and Freedom, 1812 to 1897. I had the privilege of hearing Dr. Thompson speak earlier today about the research for this talk.
I
thought
it was a discussion.
it was a discussion. It was a beautiful discussion, and I think we're in for a little treat tonight.
Okay, thank you so much, Alexa. So the first thing I'll say is understand what I'm going to present today, I wrote over the last 3 weeks. So it really is like a work in progress idea. I put that into the room to say, if things are feeling like, now we're talking about this, where do we go from there? Understand that these are my ideas on this topic, and the way, and a lot of this topic is through our conversation, right? Like we just had a conversation of like, what are you thinking about? And you know, I am an academic, so when someone says, what are you thinking about? I go into my Rolodex of thoughts, and this is what came out the other end. So I hope you enjoy it, and I hope it makes you think, and it poses some questions. So first, I want to say that today my talk is going to sort of deal with computer technology, radio, a little of the telegraph. We're going to talk about art, dance, literature, all these things that maybe on their own you wouldn't think connects, but I hope at the end you see the connection as I do. So the first thing is, I want to start with this right here. This is my childhood computer. So this is the first computer that we had in our home. And this is a Commodore Amiga 500, 16-bit from 1987. This computer was introduced by the Commodore International Corporation in 1985. And this is their first computer from 1977. And I love what it's called, the Personal Electronic Transactor, otherwise known as a PET. And some of you might have seen this in Hollywood films. This computer actually shows up a lot in movies. So it's in The Theory of Everything, and it was actually in Wayne's World, at the back there. You can see it there. So a lot of this old technology that we obviously no longer use still shows up in the media culture that we all absorb. But I was very interested when I started putting this together. I was like, Commodore, man, they were so huge back in the day, if you're old enough to remember them. And I thought, what's up with this one? Did you know that this, up until 2011, this was the best-selling computer of all time, till 2011, according to Guinness Book of World Records. The Commodore 64, which was an 8-bit home computer introduced in 1982. This model sold between 12.5 and 17 million units during its lifetime. And I start with this to really pose the question, do you remember any of these? Like, have you ever seen them before? This is interactive, so I'm really asking. Like, how many of you remember these? How many of you have never seen any of these computers before? Interesting. And so I start with that to say, you know, so much of technology is about what's coming next and the future. And this talk is really going to go back into the past of like where all of these things came from and sort of the development story. And so the sort of the through line that I'm using to tie all this together is this idea of tense. And so I was very curious about, I'm just very curious about words and language and tense. And so I looked on Britannia Dictionary. How many of you read the dictionary? Thank you so much. Your hand went up quick. Because the dictionary is often a really good way to say, hey, am I actually understanding the meaning or intention of this word, right? So when it comes to tense, there actually are two different types of tense, if I'm using that even correctly, that I think relate to what I'm talking about. So the first is the simple past. So the simple past tense, it's like a verb tense, is an action that started in the past, it's finished in the past, and it's not continuing now. It doesn't tell you anything about when an action happened, so you need more information to be given with this particular verb tense, such as when did this thing actually take place? It's like saying, oh, the sun set. Well, when did that happen? Same thing with the present perfect. This is a different verb tense. So when the action started in the past, it is continuing now, or it's something that happens regularly. So it may tell us the time period it started in, but it's also still ongoing. And I'm using these two like verb tenses as like running themes throughout this talk, because often technology is really presented in a simple past tense. It happened, it's over. We don't use that anymore. They came up with this is the new model. Everything is like a linear, that's over, now it's this time. What I'm trying to put into the space is to think about the present perfect of technology and how it's always kind of in various states of ongoingness and or erasure. And I don't mean erasure of the technology, I mean erasure of like people, places, and history. That as new technology is developed, it's actually erasing people, and it's erasing different ways in which we come to understand its meaning. And so my talk today is about all of that as it relates to Black history. And so what I'm really interested in exploring in the talk is sort of how all of this also relates to memory. And the ways in which technology history, in my opinion, through this talk, what I'm really arguing is that it's so simplified. The way we think of these technologies are so simplified and glossed over, myself included, that we often don't connect the technology, in my opinion, to history and culture in the same way we do the arts. So when we think of art, it would be impossible to talk about art without connecting it to history and culture. But we don't always talk about technology in that way. Instead, we talk about it in terms of functionality. Like we have this equipment and now I have this and it can do all these cool things that the previous thing couldn't do. What I'm putting into the space is to think about how technology, I hope you'll see my argument, should be thought of like art, that it is connected to culture and history in very similar ways. And so throughout the talk, and part of this is coming from, you know, if you're on the interweb that I'm on, you know, there's been a lot of talk about artificial intelligence the last, I would say, what, 2 years, really, it's hit the mainstream. What I want to propose, I am going to talk about that a bit at the end, but I really want to get to like how we got here in terms of the seemingly urgent questions that people are now asking about AI. You know, why are we not asking those urgent questions about our laptop, right? AI, it's like a panic that we need to start asking all these questions. So I'm kind of playing with that idea. At the same time, I'm going to be drawing on, in the second half of the talk, examples from literature, art, photography, dance, to kind of question some of the the debates that have happened and are ongoing in technology, I'm sort of making the argument that you can see some of these debates when you go back into a particular time period in the 20th century and you look at the art, the literature, and dance. You can actually see some of the same arguments being made. And so the questions of this talk: what is the tense of technoculture? What's Canada got to do with it? I'm going to draw on some Canadian examples that maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't. And then what is the tense of Black technoculture? And so the main point, I guess, of what I'm trying to get at, you know, if any of you know anything about my work, I'm also very much interested in cultural memory and how things sort of get taken up in the culture, but often something's missing. You know, like something's not quite fully as it probably happened. I'm interested in that connection between those two things. And so I'm going to start with 20th century technoculture. So I'm just going to give a little brief summation of like how we get to the computer. Because most people actually don't know. How many of you know the history of the computer? Like where it came from, the time, like who did it, the internet, how we got the WW, all that stuff? We really don't know when we're interacting with it. So I'm going to just give a little quick summation of that. But in order to get there, we sort of have to start here with radio. So in the late 19th century, and this is going to tie into, you know, if any of you have ever wondered, like, why Silicon Valley? Like, why San Francisco? Why that region that we now equate with so much technology? Well, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, San Jose, or the Santa Clara Valley that connects San Jose and San Francisco, they really were hubs for shipping. And because they were hubs for shipping, they became sort of the center of telegraphy. And early radio was born out of San Jose, California. So the first commercial radio station was founded out of San Jose by Charles Harold, who launched KCBS 740 AM. I think it's still in operation today. That's still a working radio station. And so by 1909, across the US, over the 1910s, you have the expansion of radio. In Canada, it comes sort of in the same decade, but much later. And so here we have in 1918, this is sort of publicly available information, so I'm not really digging too deep into the archive here. The Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company was founded in 1918, and it's sort of considered the first commercial radio in Canada. So that's 1918. That's about a decade after you have commercial radio in the US. And over the course of the 1920s, that's where radio in Canada really begins to expand. So by the end of the 1920s, there are dozens of radio stations kind of coast to coast, and that's really the first form of mass communication that is linking people in disparate geographic space to content, that we would call it content to this day. But, you know, this is really the simple past of radio in Canada. Do you know who else might have been experimenting with radio technology in the 1920s? Like, have you ever heard of any other examples of radio in the 1920s? Well, okay. So this is the reason, this next slide is the reason I study archives. Because when I was in the archive, I found this front page from The Dawn of Tomorrow. And this is from 1923. And I have an up-close shot if you can read it better. So Harold Jackson, 22 Chatham, said to be the first and only licensed Negro radio in Canada, city manager of the American Radio Relay League, traffic manager of the Chatham Radio Club. He operates an experimental radio, telephone, and telegraph station, both sending and receiving messages. And when I saw this, I thought, how? How could he have been doing this in 1923? Like, that's not the story of radio. The story of radio is that the Marconi Telegraph Company started a station. And it made me think about, if they have a, what is it, the Chatham Radio Club couldn't have just been Harold Jackson. That means there was a whole bunch of people into radio. What happened to those people? And what happened to their stories? And how did they do it? Where did they get the physical material to access radio? And so for those of you who don't know, The American Radio Relay League is actually still in operation today. It's a real thing. It's the largest membership association of amateur radio enthusiasts in the US, and it still exists. And so there are still people to this day who have this kind of technology that, you know, recently I was talking to someone, they were like, yeah, man, radio is dead. I'm like, is it though? Or are there still people who are playing around with this like analog technology and doing things that are under the radar? And so it made me think when I was putting this talk together, and it, like, the question I thought when I saw Harold Jackson was, who was he broadcasting to? Right? Like, who was listening? Was that in Canada? If anyone knows geography, where Chatham is located, maybe the audience was American. Like, maybe that's who was listening. Who knows? Any of you history people out there, maybe that's a new project to work on, because I'm sure there is much more to the rabbit hole. Well, you have a question, or are you? Yes. Exactly. So that is the question, right? It's a question mark. I don't have an answer. But it asks you to think about this simple narrative of radio that has been so part of the landscape. Maybe it needs to be questioned, right? This is commercial radio. I'm sure there are a lot of amateurists who are also doing their work at the same time, right? And so why I start with this is because I want you to think about this, you know, radio and telegraphy, which I'm actually going to get to at the end. They were mass forms. They were technology that enabled mass communication and exchange. That's not the origin story of the computer. The computer was never invented for mass communication. The origin story of the computer, how it emerged, that kind of technology, was for the mass information summarization, tabulation, and calculation. That is actually the origin of the thing that we would call the computer. So let's go back to 1887. In 1887, the US Census Bureau was still interpreting figures from the 1880 census because they were doing it by hand. Can you imagine? Whew, the work. That's why if anyone has ever looked at census records 19th century, it's really hard sometimes because you can't make out sometimes what's being said. 1890 was a pivotal year because that was the year of the Hollerith tabulator. So that was the year that they asked Herman Hollerith, tabulator, that was actually his name, to design a machine that could tabulate the numbers electronically so that people didn't have to do it by hand. And so he came up with basically punch cards. I'm sure this is in some archive somewhere, the actual kind of punch card system. And by the 1920s, however, that company was known as International Business Machines. And sort of IBM, this is the IBM, all those ThinkPads that I saw people on today, I'm like, this is the origin of it. So IBM really is a company who started as the tabulating company for the US Census Bureau. And that was, you know, we're talking about 1890 and then really through the 1920s. The next leap is in the 1930s. So in the 1930s, any of you seen The Imitation Game? Because it kind of tells that story, right? It's in 1936 when the British mathematician Alan Turing wrote a paper on computable numbers, and he basically provided the theoretical description of a general purpose computer, or something that could, you know, jump out numbers but also kind of make sense of them, known as the universal Turing machine. So this is what it looks like. And I remember when I used to teach this in my class, the first time I saw this machine, I was like, man, this machine looks like something to me. Just looking at this, does it look like something? Like, does it look like something else? Right. It looks like a film projector. So this is actually a 1930s film projector. So the Turing machine and the film projector were essentially created at the same time-ish, right? Now, what do these two things both do? Because they actually function the exact same way. What does the film projector do that the Turing machine does?
I mean, they process information just in different ways. So like the projector does it visually, whereas the Turing machine does it through like numbers and words.
Exactly. I mean, in other words, what happened? Why did I go backwards? Sorry, that was a backflip. Yeah, they basically, in simple terms, they both record and store data. They do the same thing. And I think when I had this like aha moment, I was like, wow, that's so fascinating that they both record and store data, and now our computers can basically do all that too, right? Like our computer basically acts like a film projector and a Turing machine at the same time, brought together. That's the 30s. The next major leap in computing is actually in the 1950s, also in San Jose, California. Sherman Fairchild founded a company known as Fairchild Semiconductor. By the 1960s, the Fairchild Semiconductor is really credited with creating the first components for the Apollo space program in the early 1960s. And at the same time, around that time, there was someone who worked for Fairchild known as Gordon Moore. And he wrote an essay called Cramming More Components Onto Integrated Circuits. And it's because of that essay that he then created what we now call as Moore's Law. Anyone in computer science, let's skip that, anyone in computer science, they actually learn Moore's Law. It's like a fundamental law of how do you shrink information onto chips, basically. Like how do you condense enough information that it can be stored on something so small that it can then be a component of something, essentially. And so this is the reason in this time period in the 1960s that the semiconductor industry completely exploded over the 60s and then into the 1970s. It's actually in 1969, an organization known as the Stanford Research Institute, please remember SRI. So SRI, which was established in the 1940s as a World War II kind of think tank to create things for the war, by the 1960s, it's now in the computer game. And part of SRI is another organization known as ARPANET, or ARPANET, also known as Advanced Research Projects Agency Network. This is a lot of information, but please bear with me. So this is a government organization that was funded by the Department of Defense. And so it's in the 1960s that computers are kind of taking on a different tone. Because now you have government agencies funded by defense building semiconductors and sort of funding the institutions out of Stanford and that region in California that are coming up with new inventions in computing technology. And so by the time you get into the 1970s, Xerox opens up the Palo Alto Research Center, also known as Park Lab, that some of you might have heard of, and they're essentially tasked with early Ethernet computing and the graphical user interface that I'm going to talk about. And so all of this is happening, but this is really the simple past of technology. Everything I just said, you can Google, and you will find it very clearly outlined who did what when in the 1960s. And I really want you to think about this narrative that I'm giving to you. It's not in my presentation, but in the popular culture, whenever the 1960s are called upon, what do they reference? It's the 1960s. What's the first thing they're going to say that happened in the 1960s? Social, like civil rights, or like women's rights. They're going to focus on all the gay rights, disability rights. They're going to focus on all the rights. They're probably not going to tell you, no, isn't that when semiconductors really took off in the world? So we're never asked to think about the semiconductor industry that develops at the same time in the culture. There's all this massive change happening because they're really happening at the same time. And it's really, for me, and you kind of saw a prelude when I was testing my audio, but it was really Hidden Figures that kind of changed the game. Hidden Figures, people were like, there are black people that worked at NASA in the 1960s? Yeah, and they were all women. And they were mathematicians, programmers, engineers. In this image here, you see 3 of them, Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, and Dorothy Vaughan, but there was also Eunice Smith and Catherine Pedrew. These were the black mathematicians and engineers who were also working at NASA, who were responsible for all the calculations and tabulations needed for the space program. So while SRI and ARPANET were creating the chips and the sort of the technology, they still needed humans to do the calculations and to figure out the math, essentially, of, well, how are you going to make this work? And so this movie completely disrupted the narrative around the space program. Because most people, be honest, until Hidden Figures, how many of you even knew that there were black women who worked at NASA in the 1960s? I didn't know that. You knew that? Oh, come on. Were you time traveling? No. Okay, I actually believe you. Okay, sure you were. I do believe you. We can talk later, but I'm somewhat skeptical. But the point is that they were there. They were doing the work. And so I just want to show you a little scene from the movie for those who haven't seen it, because Dorothy Vaughan was also a Fortran programmer. So Fortran, if you don't know, is sort of like the programming language of numeric computation and scientific computing. She was at the forefront of that in her career. And so this is just a little cute scene that I love, and see if you can notice the equipment that she's using.
Okay.
Atta girl.
Hey, what the hell are you doing? You can't be in here. Who are you?
I'm with the West Computing Group. Dorothy Vaughan, sir.
Well, this is a very delicate piece of equipment.
I'm sorry, sir. I'm just trying to be helpful.
Bill, we've got numbers.
What kind of numbers? What's your name again?
Dorothy Vaughan.
Dorothy Vaughan.
I mean, that's kind of still a Hollywoodization of what she probably went through, but it does give you like a good sense of it. But this is happening in the late 1960s. Does anyone know when and how Silicon Valley gets its name? Like, when does that happen? Anyone? Well, it happens after this. It really was in 1971. A journalist, Dan Hoffler, wrote this 3-part report on the semiconductor industry, and he, or the publication, called it that, Silicon Valley, and it just stuck. It's not anything related to the fact that there were all these semiconductor industries. It was that a journalist wrote about it and labeled it as such. And again, my training is in communication studies, so I always love these intersections of media, history, and technology, because most people probably thought that that was an industry term that they named themselves, but it was actually the media who named them, and it stuck. And so from the 1970s onward, that's when you really have a change in the game. Because the first, and this is where I'm going to transition now and talk about the graphical user interface, other known as GUI, and a Canadian search engine that you might not have also heard of. The first iterations of a graphical user interface. So that is basically this idea of a clickable interface cursor and remedial computer mouse, like all those things connecting, was demoed at SRI's Augmented Intellect Research Center in 1968. So in 1968, they're working on this technology that you can essentially, having the GUI allows you to really start to interact with the computer. It's no longer just something tabulating numbers. Now you're moving the cursor and you're making decisions, essentially, of where it is that you want the technology to go. So that's 1968. It's not until 1983 that Apple is really, this is the Apple Lisa. Anyone ever heard of the Apple Lisa? Classic. So this is really the first computer with a GUI setup, where that's why Apple is always seen as like ahead of the game, because in many ways they were. They were the first company, outside of my beloved Commodore Amiga, to create that interaction that you now move the cursor and computer is interacting with what you do. It's not just like doing its thing and you don't really know how it works. And so Lisa was also the first sort of computer console where the writing was like white and green. Before then, I should say, the computers looked like this. Like computers in the 1970s was always a black screen and green text, right? It was always that kind of interface. And there was always, and this is the IBM 5151 monitor driven by a monochrome display adapter from 1981. I don't remember this, but if you worked in an office in the early 1980s, I'm sure this is probably what you worked on. And so this computer, I'm going to go back to the Lisa. The Lisa outsold Apple's first computer. Can you imagine this monstrosity? It doesn't even make any kind of sense why you would place that monitor so high onto what are floppy disks for the young folks, those thin things that we don't use anymore. But this was their kind of first go at it. But again, look at the screen, right? Like it used to be this like black screen and green text thing. And the reason this caught my eye was in 2018, American Artists, it's a magazine named American Artists, they wrote this paper called Black GUI Universe. And in that paper, they asserted, quote, the transition of the computer interface from a black screen to the white screen is an apt metaphor for the theft and erasure of blackness, as well as a literal insistence of a white ideological mechanism created with the intent of universal application. So if we think about the first generation, it's the reason why the Word doc is still that white page. Why is that? You have to change the color, like you have to physically change it if you want it to be something else. And so when I read that article, it kind of put into my mindset like, oh, I've never really thought about this too deeply. But here, in this quote here, before the 1970s, computer screens were black. But now when you open a new document or begin a new search online, the background is typically white. It wasn't always like that. And I think in most people's memories, they don't know that it wasn't always like that. Like that's not really standard. That happened over the course of time. And so over the past few years, I'm sure many of you have noticed that there's more flexibility with the dark screen. Recently, maybe within the last few months, Google allowed you to dark screen your calendar all of a sudden. You never could do that before. So part of what I'm also getting at, and some of the articles I've read about this, not academic articles, just tech articles, they're saying, well, it's for health reasons, right? To cut down the blue light and all these reasons why screens are suddenly going black. The cynic in me says, well, does 2020 have anything to do with it? And is it more political than it's just for health reasons? Why suddenly now there's more thought that the computer screen can be some other color other than white? Like, is there other politics? I don't know. This is, again, I'm putting it out there for students, right? This is like a topic. Look into it, because I really don't know. And I'm only trying to elucidate in this talk that the norm of your lifetime was not always the norm. It transitioned over a period of time. And that period of time was really from the 1970s into the 1980s. And here I want to start getting into some theory. That's a long intro to get into some theory. But I wanted to set the stage so that we're all dealing with the same understanding of technology in its time. So in 2007, Lisa Nakamura wrote a book called Digitizing Race, Visual Cultures of the Internet. And in this book, she asserts that as interfaces become more ubiquitous, no, I'm not there yet. As interfaces become more ubiquitous, means of accessing media of all kinds, their work enters the popular sphere and the public culture, and hence a corresponding interest in their modes of insatiating identity, their unavoidable application in creating mental trajectories that we must follow, must emerge from cultural and media theory. And then she says, instead, the interface itself becomes a star. And just like other sorts of stars, it works to compel racialized identifications. Interfaces are prima loci, I think that's how you say that, for digital racial formation. So Nakamura's point about the interface mimicking both a normal, quote-unquote, normative mental structure and sets of associations, and this is 2007, she's really saying that often those normative mental structures and sets of associations are white and Eurocentric. Like, all of us are navigating in that modality when we use the computer. And we have to follow that logic. And Nakamura is also saying in this book from 2007 that there's a sort of logic to that that is a kind of digital capitalism. And she's really one of the first who was talking about this, like, digital capitalism, like that technology is intersected with capital in a particular kind of way. And so that was, what, 17 years ago, just a few years ago. Carlton Melwin, I can never say his name, McElwin, that's right, wrote a book called Black Software, The Internet and Racial Justice, From the Afronet to Black Lives Matter. And in this book, he says, predictably, online visibility increased in value. As online visibility increased in value, Black people's visibility within the open web began to diminish. The more the web expanded, the more Black people, Black content, and Black interests receded from view. Search engines like Google became the dominant traffic cop, steering users one way or another until the internet looked as segregated as any American. So the question, right, that I'm really trying to get at as I continue on this, like, development of technology journey is thinking about, you know, why does it even, this is really the question, like, does any of this even matter? Does it matter that computer screens used to be black and now they're not? Like, I'm just putting the question, I don't have the answer. I see you nodding like, yeah, it does matter. Right? But I really want you to think about it, and because the argument that I'm really trying to elucidate here is that that change is rooted in a cultural change. And so why don't we connect that to the technological change? That there is something going on. It's not just some programmer who's like, hey, I have an idea today. Why don't we just make screens black on our next run of computers? I think it's a little more complex than that. It's coming from somewhere, and that somewhere isn't often interrogated enough. Let's jump forward to 1983. So 1983 is a pivotal year. That's the year that ARPANET, that I talked about, implemented what's known as the TCP/IP that many of you might have heard of, otherwise known as Transmission Control Protocol/Internet Protocol. This is the suite of communication protocols that are used to connect devices. Without the TCP/IP, computers can't connect. So before then, the NCP was kind of like Hidden Figures. It was like discrete computers that could talk to computers that were in the room and maybe on a network, but they couldn't connect to a global. You needed the TCP/IP that said, here's now like and there's no WW yet, so there's no like websites, but here's now this ability to say, we can connect devices in this much wider network. You almost want to think of it as like bandwidth. The bandwidth of computers completely changed with the TCP/IP. And so that was 1983. Does anyone know when we get the World Wide Web? Because it doesn't happen in 1983. I mean, where did you come from? Parents are doing a good job. You're in it. Okay, that question's been answered. Yes, it is 1989, but it's through this organization named CERN. Has anyone ever heard of CERN? Yes. So CERN, for those who don't know, is the European Organization for Nuclear Research, otherwise known as CERN. So in 1989, so the legend goes, a person by the name of Tim Berners-Lee was working at CERN. And Tim Berners-Lee submitted an application for a World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee is then said somehow, I'm sure he was working with a team though, it wasn't just Tim on his own, somehow he then said, you know what, the TCP IP is not going to do it. What you need next is a hypertext transfer protocol, also known as a HTTP. Without the HTTP, there is no www, there is no World Wide Web. That is sort of the way that the two connect. And it's great you're connected, but how are you gonna, like, what is the language of this new system? Well, as you can imagine where I'm going next, that's where the hypertext markup language comes from. You need a HTML that you can actually, the computer has to write in its own language, right? That other computers are in the same language because computers speak one language. Doesn't matter if you're in France or Germany. Computers still speak the same HTML language. But that's all good and good, but you need something else. You need a URL. That's what comes after the dot, www dot. Legend has it that Tim Berners-Lee is said to have created all of this at CERN. How many of you believe that story? How many of you think that's actually even possible? That one human could just all of a sudden. And this is not a critique on that person. It's why in the culture do we not learn about this and question it? Like, that's really the question I'm asking. Like, it's sort of like, this is like a given. Most people don't even know what the HTTP is or why do we need that? And if you notice now on a lot of websites, you don't even need that anymore. You could just put in the www. Well, how is that possible? Who changed that in the system? And so all of this allows us to connect. So all of a sudden now we have this ability to connect and we have all of this. But what happened in 1994 and 95? That's when the parenting stopped. Like, you got to figure it out on your own. If you can imagine in the iteration where this is going, what comes next? You have computers talking to each other. You have a language. You have a way for resource sites to be made. But what do you need? What? No. Think, what comes next? Browsers. You have to be able to search. What is an internet without search? So this is a nice little timeline that I found online. And it tells you every single thing that happened. Look at 69. Look at the big gaps. And then all of a sudden from 94, it's just like a floodgates opened. The floodgates completely opened. And since then, that's like a 30-year period, the search engine has been how we think of accessing the internet. We don't even think, some of these companies aren't even around anymore. You remember when AOL was a big deal? If anyone's ever seen that movie, You've Got Mail, when you watch that movie now, it seems so like a different time, literally, right? It's because that's defunct now. And so all of this is to lead you up to where I needed to get you up to, that now we can actually get into the talk. This is a very long intro, because now we're all working with the same information to think about this technology. And so let's go on to Safia Umoja Noble, who wrote a book, Algorithms of Oppression, and she writes that neoliberal impulses in the United States to support market-driven information portals such as Google Search have consequences for finding high-quality information on the internet about people and communities, since this is the primary pathway to navigating the web. This is one of the many contradictions of the current for-profit search and cloud computing industry. She says future research efforts might address questions that can help us understand the role of the design of platforms. So she's writing this 2018, that's like about 6 years ago. That's the first one, right? What time is it? Don't worry. I'm gonna wrap this up, okay? Future research efforts might address questions that can help us understand the role of design platforms, interfaces, software, and experiences as practices that are culturally and gender situated and often determined by economic imperatives, power, and values. What I'm also saying is that future research needs to be focused on technology's memory and the simplified narrative of technoculture. So how many of you have ever heard of the Archie search engine? Or Alan Amtage, or Emtage. Anyone? I saw you nodding your head. You have. No, when did you hear? When? How? That's right. You would have, but it's good. Anyone else? Search engine. I mean, I love this story because it speaks so much to what I'm trying to get at. So in 1990, this is Archie. In 1990, this was a pre-web-based, pre-web, pre-internet search engine for locating materials known as Public File Transfer Protocol, these FTP archives. Point is that this is considered the world's first search engine. Pre-web though. So it's not a Google and it's not a Bing, so it's not connected to the internet as we know it, but it's still functioning as a search engine. So this was created by Alan Emtage, who was a black technologist who went to McGill, my alma mater. So this is actually a Canadian, Archie was a Canadian invention, essentially, that was invented at McGill. He was a grad student. And this is an article that I found from 2017. He's originally from Barbados. In 1989, he was a grad student who was working as a systems administrator at McGill University in the Information Technology Department. And he essentially, it was his job to find software for students and faculty. So he kind of invented this search engine so that you can connect things, right? You can put in the search bar and find things. And the reason I bring this up, there's a long quote that I'm not going to read, but I'll show it to you, is that to think about the fact that someone like this person doesn't really come up when we think of search engines. And obviously you can understand why, because it's not connected to the quote-unquote internet as we know. This is pre-web. But nonetheless, to me, this is a person who should be standard. If you're in computer science, you should know about Alan Emtage. Why not? Especially if you're studying at a Canadian university. That should be standard. But it probably isn't, because it doesn't count within the larger scheme of things. Let me hit you with another quote. So this is from Ruha Benjamin, who wrote a book called After Technology, which examines how technocultures have erased things, making other things visible. And what she says is that computer programming languages, codes, and algorithms can act as narratives that reaffirm existing inequalities and operate within powerful systems of meaning that render some things visible, others invisible, and create a vast array of distortions and dangers. At the same time, in her work on images, Tina Campt, and this is Tina Campt in Listening to Images, she writes that futurity is not a question of hope, though it is certainly inescapably intertwined with the idea of aspiration. She says that it is crucial to think about futurity through a notion of tense. This is actually where this idea really implanted into my mind. And so I am asking, through what I just said to you, what is the tense of technoculture? How should we place it? Is it solely in this discrete past, or is it an ongoing conversation that we should be having with technology? And let's think about the other thing that Tina Campt says. So on the question of what is the tense of a black future, she writes, it is a tense of anteriority, a tense relationship to an idea of possibility that is neither innocent nor naive, nor is it necessarily heroic or intentional. It is often humble and strategic, subtle and discriminating. It is devious and exacting. It's not always loud and demanding. It is frequently quiet and opportunistic, dogged and disruptive. And so I want to transition now into the going back through black histories and connecting them to current day discussions on technology and the tensions of what I see occurring in the past that are still happening in the present. So here is a nice long, passage from W.E.B. Du Bois, writing in this essay called Strivings of the Negro People. And I will read this quote. Between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question. Unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it, all nevertheless flutter around it. Am I reading the same thing? Yes, I am. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then, instead of asking directly, how does it feel to be a problem, they say, I know an excellent colored man in my town. Or, I fought at Mechanicsville. Or, do not these Southern outrages make your blood boil? At these I smile, or am interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion might require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem, I answer seldom a word. Can anyone imagine what year this was written in? Do you know? Hazard a guess. Hazard a guess! It's for free! Just guess. Just somebody throw out a number. No. So, oh, I said it. It came out already. 1897. So in 1897, he's writing this. And I want to draw your attention to something that literally came into my vortex a month ago. And it was a LinkedIn post from October. A woman by the name of Christelle Mobo Zinga, who's founder of digitalcolorism.com, posted a story on her page. And in it, she detailed how she is passionate about AI. Since diving into this technology in 2021, she made it her mission to promote responsible AI, addressing concerns about safety, security, fairness, transparency, and bias. But despite her love of the field, she described a troubling issue, and she called it digital colorism, how AI headshot generators are failing dark-skinned users. And so she details how she tried several AI headshot generators, both free and paid, to experiment with their accuracy for use on social media profiles. But to her disappointment, of the very biases that marginalize dark-skinned women and girls in real life, colorism, featureism, texturism, and sizeism, were glaringly present in the digital tools. And I want to just read what she said. This is more than a technical glitch. These headshot generators aren't just editing photos, they're altering identities. In one of my experiences, the AI drastically lightened my skin, changed my hair texture, and even slimmed my face, essentially erasing parts of who I am. And so when I heard this, I thought to myself, doesn't it sound like we're still asking this double consciousness question of always looking at ourselves through the eyes of something outside of us? Like, isn't that the same conversation that this person is having in the present? That there's a two-ness to technology for the Black user, of seeing yourself through the eyes projected back to you that does not reflect you, but that it's one that is sort of created out of, maybe it is contempt, who knows? It's a weird duality that I'm seeing with these conversations around technology that, as a historian, feel like conversations people were having at the turn of the last century about seeing themselves through the eyes of the dominant culture. Let's move on. Time? Okay. And I also thought of this. We just marked Remembrance Day, and it's only been in recent years that we now consider the No. 2 Construction Battalion. Like, I mean recent years, like 2022? 23, if that. And so the No. 2 Construction Battalion was the first all-Black regiment to fight in World War I. And in many ways, their memory was thanks to Melissa Shaw, Sarah Jane, thank you so much, Lindsay Ruck, the granddaughter of Calvin Ruck, who wrote one of the first books in the 1980s. And the reason I'm going here, just bear with me, is that historian Kathy Grant, public historian, started this website called Black Canadian Veterans because she felt like they were being erased. And if you didn't have a place to find out about the veterans, like a digital place, that they would be erased. And so she created this website through her own. Kathy Grant is not an academic. She's like a person, just a private citizen whose dad happened to fight in World War II. And she took it upon herself to point out the gaps and say, hey, War Military Museum, you're not paying attention to our Black veterans. And this really made me think of the other ways that Black people are telling the world that you're not seeing us. You're leaving us out of a conversation as you're developing whatever it is you're developing. I'm not going to play this for time, but how many of you have ever heard of Joy? I can never pronounce her last name, Bulamwini. Anyway, she was born in Edmonton, lives now in America, and we register her as American. She has dual citizenship. But the point is, she wrote a book called Unmasking AI, My Mission to Protect What is Human in a World of Machines. And this book was published in 2023. I highly recommend it. And what she's basically, in my opinion, again, this is the stretch of my argument, she's kind of doing a similar thing to what Kathy Grant is doing. It's just totally different context. She's really trying to say to us, you are developing this thing, but you're not remembering us. You're not thinking about our histories. You're not thinking about how we show up. You're not thinking about the ways in which we interact with these things. That's the reason when it gets developed, it's like we feel left out of the conversation. We feel like it doesn't quite fit with who we are as people. And I really want to go quickly now. I have to go quickly because I'm kind of running out of time. Skip that. Back to the world of art. So this is Lois Mailloux Jones. And the only reason I know of this art, it's going to come to you, I'm going to reveal it when I show you one of the other images. Any Erykah Badu fans? I love Erykah Badu. And there was an album that she did in 2010, and I was like, man, why does this album is something registering with this album? It's hitting me. Point is, Lois Mailloux Jones was a Haitian artist, born in Haiti, but lived in America. In 1938, she paints this watercolor painting, Les Fétiches, and it depicts 5 different ancient African masks, which would have been in the style of modernism. During her time, she was actually very much critiqued about why are you doing this work? And one of the things that she said was that I had to remind them of I can never say his name, Modigliani and Picasso, and all of the French artists using the inspiration of Africa. And if anybody had a right to use it, she said, I had it, it was my heritage. So she was having to defend herself in a sea of modern artists who did not. They were creating amazing pieces of work that was considered to be new. And they never had to defend why they were getting their inspiration from Africa, essentially. And if you look at this Badu album that I'm showing you here from 2010, obviously going back into the past, taking inspiration from this portrait from 1938. And so in this album cover, New America, by the way, if you listen to this album, Erykah Badu claims she is the person who brought woke back into the culture because she has a song where she talks about it in 2010. And that's when the media started to say, what is this wokeness all of a sudden? She claims, not me. But the point of this is I'm going to show you a series of images, and I want you to think about how the Black artist, through multiple mediums, is always engaging with the past, is always going back to past forms. And so from Erykah Badu, we have Beyonce in 2020, Black is King. We have Sun Ra. Anyone Sun Ra? Jazz artist from the 1960s, 70s, who had claimed to have gone to Saturn in around 1937, 38. And that's when he became Sun Ra. And he literally said, I went to Saturn. And I love that it was a different era because nobody questioned it. Now we would be like, do you need medication for the hallucinations? Back then, nobody questioned it. They're like, yeah, of course he did. But look at Janelle Monáe, clearly also tapping back into the same aesthetic. And the reason I'm showing you this is because part of Afrofuturism, where this talk is kind of getting some of its inspiration, is to think about how black thought is always engaging with itself. It's always going back and mixing forms. And the real question to ask is, why doesn't the dominant culture do the same? Like, why doesn't the dominant narrative of technology do the same? go back into past forms and reveal the forms to us and let us know where their inspirations are coming from. Instead, they never talk about their inspirations. It's only what the new product release is, and never where they're getting their ideas from. And so Yatisha Womack says, in talking about Afrofuturism, in the book Afrofuturism, The World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy Culture from 2014, she says Afrofuturism is an intersection of imagination, technology, the future, and liberation. And I think this simple quote really summarizes why Afrofuturism, as it relates to technology, just allows you to destabilize the simple past narrative of where all of these things come from. Because Afrofuturism doesn't have a timeline, right? Lois Malou-Jones was an Afrofuturist, just like Sun Ra, just like Janelle Monáe, at totally different time periods. They don't even know each other. They're all engaging with this same question. And Womack goes on to say, Afrofuturism is an intersection of imagination, technology, and future and liberation. Like I said, she also says, that science fiction, this is the difference. Science fiction follows a linear narrative, typically. Someone came to Earth, and from then, Superman, like the narrative of Superman. You notice it's always a father, like the father died, and it's always something like that in science fiction. Afrofuturism doesn't really have a linear story. It actually calls on the past. You can go back to the 19th century. You can go forward into the 25th century. You could be in the present. You can do all of these things. And what Womack argues is that when you do that, it allows you to continue to reimagine identity and to not see things as static and stuck, but to see things as always in stages of development, really. And that in that development, there's always a going back to the past. So how am I on time? I have to make some choices. I'm going to skip some of this. No. It is what it is. It's my fault. I'll just get to this, because I still want to show at least one of the dance videos. So Vivi Clark, who's writing about Catherine Dunham, who was a dancer in the 1940s, she talks about this idea of the development of lieu de mémoire, a place of memory, as a concept among scholars of French Revolutionary history that presupposes emotional and intellectual distance from memory and history. She says distinctions, do I have it in here? Distinctions among memory, history, and lieu de mémoire in Africa and the Caribbean result primarily from class distinctions rather than an erosion of trust in telling one's story. I'm abridging that quote because she goes on to a lot of other things, but I really want you to think of this concept of a place of memory, because a place of memory is so key in Afrofuturism, Afro-diasporic studies, studies of the transatlantic slavery. Where are you locating self in this sort of memory that's tied into culture and history? And so Tobias Wilfrid, who's writing in 2017 about Afrofutures and African and the aesthetics of Black Revolution, one of the things that he says is that this is why in so many of these, you wonder why like artists of the US and Canada, why are they interacting with Africa so much, even if they're not quote unquote African? No, that's not really how it works. Tobias Wilfrid says, well, Africa can function not only as a means to stake Black presence in the past, but it can function as a means to assert Black presence in the future. So if any of you Black Panther people out there, right, that's really where this is coming from, that it's both offering a past and a future, and it's offering an aesthetic form through which to project the possibilities of radical Black futures. So it's this idea of working across multiple time and place. Now, I wanted to show you two different clips of African dance, but I don't have time. So I'm only gonna show you the second clip, and I do still wanna show that, and then I wanna show you what happens when you Google search this particular thing. So before I get to it, in 1930s, again, the 1930s, there was a person by the name of Asadata Dafora Horton, also known as Asadata Dafora, forget the Horton part. They were born in Freetown, Sierra Leone. They came to America and they introduced African drumming in the 1930s. 40 so years later, Charles Moore, who was an African-American dancer, he recalled this moment when Asadata Dafora came to America and performed a dance known as Awasa Ostrich that he then called the ostrich. I just want to show this dance, and then I have to skip the other one, and then we'll just get into it, and I swear to you, I will wrap it up in 10 minutes. Oh, my bad, where are you going? Sorry, I realized this one I have to press it. And hopefully it's not too
loud. Growing up in Cleveland, I saw Asadata Dafora do the ostrich at Severance Hall. It was the first time I ever saw African dance. Later I came to New York. I studied with Catherine Dunham and Charles Weidman. But I never forgot that first glimpse of Africa.
What do you think happens if you Google ostrich? We can't watch this. And dance in Google Images. What do you think comes up? Just ostrich and dance. No. You get literally ostriches dancing. And a white guy. Now, if you don't know who Asadata Dafora is, if you don't know Charles Moore, the video that I skipped, the African American Dance Festival, if you don't know those black histories, you can't find that dance. You'll only find this. And so part of the question of technology is to really think about the ways that black people are left out of technology. Like, if you take anything away from my talk, that's really what I'm trying to get at. The narrative, the simple past of technology does not include black histories. They have to get added. They're just purely additive. And so I'm just raising this to now think about what is the place of memory of AI in all of these different forms. Because they say AI is not the same thing. But what is it? And so I have to skip through this. I'm just gonna skip through this a little bit. We gotta get to this is the telegraph that I was gonna discuss. But the reason I'm talking about that is to really get to the main question of my talk, because I have to wrap it up. And the main question is, what is the present perfect tense of Black technoculture? Like, I really want you to think about that ongoing question. What is it, right? And how can we then think about that present perfect tense and the simple past of technology? How do we bridge those two things? And how do we start to disrupt what I think is really dangerous and problematic, the simpleness of how technology has been essentially told to us? And how can we use Afrofuturism and Blackness really to go back, forward, and back again into the present and kind of disrupt this timeline? And I would encourage you to think about the way to do that is to look to the arts, is to look through literature, to look through writing, to look through art, to look even through dance. That performance of the ostrich, I swear if you put a Janet Jackson choreography, you're gonna see similar moves. I swear if you take any contemporary artist, that movement with the arm, is that not breaking? You can see influences of that same dance in almost any genre of dance today. And most people don't know that that is a dance from the 1930s. How? Like, what were audiences even like in the 1930s? I have to wrap it up. I wanted to play another video of my dear colleague, Camille Turner, because she does such great work in Newfoundland, but time is running long, and this is really her going to Newfoundland as an Afrofuturist artist, going back into the past of Newfoundland to tell the story of slave ships that were built on the Atlantic coast of Canada, and how that really ties into this long, engaging question that I want to leave you with before we launch into the Q&A, is really, what is the tense of a Black future? In the past, present, and let's say it's 2025. Thanks.
I feel a little wordless right now. It was so many things, so many thoughts.
I warned you. It was a lot of things.
Yes, jam-packed, but I'll open it up to everyone in the room and also people virtually on the Zoom. Dominic is monitoring that back there. But if there's any questions to Dr. Thompson, things that maybe we missed, or questions that you have about her research or ongoing work. Oh, perfect.
It's from Sari Lafreni. Curious to get Dr. Thompson's thoughts on technology and Blackness as it relates to music and film. Where does she see this forgetfulness or lack of memory in those mediums?
Yeah, I was going to talk a lot more about music, but that would have been a 3-hour lecture, and we only had an hour. I mean, it's so clear. It's so present. I actually think if I had time, I would have gone more into the work of Janelle Monáe, because she's so clearly a contemporary artist that is fully into the knowledge of Afrofuturism. But you could even go back, for me, it's interesting that that dance, the ostrich, is from the 1970s, because a lot of 1970s artists were Afrofuturist artists. Like, I think of, if any of you Isaac Hayes people out there, if you know that album Black Moses, just listen to that album. And you can tell, and what I would say to that question, it's really more to think about the ways in which Black people have to engage with our past to survive. Like, it's actually about life, why we do it. Like, we have to go back, and we have to try to recoup. I would call it recuperative work, or it's really restorative work to make sense of, before any of this, I remember as a kid, and many of you might have had this experience, where you don't have the words, but you're like, something doesn't feel right. I've sat in rooms where I'm like, that story that you're telling me of the Caribbean doesn't add up, right? Like, but you don't have the vocabulary. So for me, I think it's almost a natural impulse. My parents are not academics, but my dad is a historian. Because it's almost a natural impulse living in the Western world to have to say, no, that doesn't actually make any sense at all. Let me do my own digging, right? And so I think when you ask about that connection, just think about the musician. I mean, the musician has to do that, not just in terms of the storytelling, but like the vocal, the chord progression, and all the other things that go into music composition. They have to be engaging with the past, so it's almost a natural fit. And I would make the same argument of the filmmaker, right? The filmmaker almost has to understand past aesthetics to really make film that is both understandable to the audience, because they have to play on some tropes that people have seen before, but also to push the genre forward. They kind of have to, in ways that maybe in other disciplines they don't think they have to as much.
All right.
Thank you for your talk this evening. I think that what I'm about to ask, it's like a softball, because I know you're thinking about it. We've talked about it like a tiny bit before. But I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on not just, like, another step to the erasure that you've been talking about is that in that erasure, there's incredible wealth moving about. And I think of, for example, the TikTok dances or expressions that are coming directly from not just Black communities, but young communities, and also communities that are economically marginalized. Yeah. And 3 Mormon housewives do that same dance, and the algorithm puts them at the top, yeah. And they, as a result, are also getting the monetization of their videos, right? And there's a lot of backlash among African American culture to that. And of course, like, we contribute to that without even knowing that we're doing it. So I shall out myself. I am obsessed with Amapiano music, which is like a tech music in a lot of ways from South Africa. But this music comes from the poorest places in South Africa, but the money goes to the DJs who are in Ibiza and whatever else, right? Like, so I'm sitting in my little suburb, trying not to hurt myself, trying to do these Amapiano dances, but none of that money or even the cred is truly going to the most untouched places, and that technology is both globalizing and it's monetizing. So, softball.
But I mean, it's softball, but it's almost like, but why would it? It's like saying, well, why didn't the slaves get any of that money from all the cotton that they picked? That's not how capitalism is actually set up to work. And digital capitalism is no different. It's not set up to feed the marginal. It's only set up to feed whiteness, right? Wealth. It's always been a wealth accumulation game. And I look at it like, when you learn about the who created some of these things, Department of Defense, Stanford University, also working through the Department of Defense. There is also a built into that mainframe, in my opinion, it's built in covertly and overtly about surveillance and control. And so they feed you, like the TikTok and the videos, to me, that's like feeding people sugar. It's like.
But I'm talking about something more than that, right? Like, I mean, we can't ignore the impact that TikTok has on shaping.
But can't we?
I don't think so.
I've never been on TikTok.
You may not have realized that you've been on TikTok.
No,
if you've watched a short.
No, I've watched a few videos. I'm not saying I haven't.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying to you is, like, I just feel like we're in an era where why can't we also realize that we don't have to participate on a global scale? Like, why can't everyone realize you actually don't have to watch that video?
Because humans suffer from YOLO? I mean, because humans are impulsive, and we thought that was only a problem for 13-year-olds, but it turns out that, like, middle-aged women can have it too.
No, it's facts. But what I'm saying to you is that I don't think technology is then really the problem, because I think it's working exactly as it's intended to work, is what I'm saying to you.
But I'm talking about what you started with, which is how this technology is used, in effect, to reinforce patterns of erasure.
Yes.
And in this way, the monetization of and the usurpation of these viral situations reinforce, right, that erasure to the point that people don't even realize where the cultures, where the terms come from, where the practices come from, where the dances come from. But
I know, but at the same time, I push back because I'm like, is that new? It's like when Madonna was rocking all that in the 1980s, everybody thought that was new.
Yes, but
that
so
was
too.
new to that audience. But just like Modigliani was new to the people, that was not new to the Africans who've been making masks for centuries.
Okay.
So it's about who is the audience for these things. Like, I think that has a lot to do with it.
Then, if so, the argument about AI making people lighter isn't new, because Vogue was doing it.
Yeah, it is
and
not
so,
new. You're right.
like that, in other words, this is how technology is put to work very early on.
Yeah.
And in so doing, it has, in fact, in a capitalist structure,
Yes.
a real financial impact on the very communities that create and generate and ultimately lose control over their cultures because of that technology.
And the question I would throw back is, well, then what?
There's a reason we're having dinner after this, people.
Yeah, right? No, but it's really to think, it's less to think
No,
about.
she doesn't know how softball works. I tossed it easily. No, go ahead. I'm kidding. Go ahead.
As I said to my Ingenium friends earlier, you asked the wrong question.
Okay.
That was the problem. But it's real. I don't think the question is really what to do about technology. I really think it's what to do about humans, like what to do about us. Because I go back to what I said, the technology is working exactly as it was intended to work. Like, so to expect that is going to somehow change is actually a ridiculous expectation. What we can change is our awareness of how the technology works. Most people don't know what an algorithm is. I tell you, my 84-year-old mother doesn't know. She has no clue about all the coding of the industry. She has no clue. To me, that's the power. The power is not in getting tech company to stop doing what it's doing. The power is to enlighten populace to understand what it's doing so that people can actually make conscious choices. It's kind of like that damn election that happened. People did not make conscious choices. They just voted with their heart. They did not actually understand the information correctly to make a conscious choice. To me, that's the question of technology. Not, what do we do about it monetizing? It's going to do that. That's my argument. But we can talk about that later. Hi, Taekwana.
This is painful because, my goodness, 10 things came up. So I have to choose. I'm going to choose 2.
Oh, what, in that?
Oh, my goodness. Because, okay, since, we will never change no matter how much we know. Your last point was it's about us as people. How many leaks and, Edward Snowden and all that.
I am an eternal optimist, though.
Well,
you might not have gotten that by the presentation, but I really am. I just believe that the more you tell yourself that you will never change, you will never change.
Individually, but our fellow people. Anyway, that wasn't my question. If you could please go to the image with the girl who was AI, passionate about AI.
The digital colors.
Yes, that's where my question is. But while you're going there, I was going to add also in the dance these Alvin Ailey Revelations. Like there was a part where I was like, oh my gosh, like it's just so incredible. And it's comforting for me because I have this, like I feel like there's an urgency in history and like.
Is this one? No. I think a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
No. Oh no, you know what? It's hidden. It's hidden under this one. Don't worry, you'll see it when it goes up.
But anyway, it's comforting because art is where it's always going to be. That I liked that you put that out there, because if we're thinking like, what's the word that doesn't sound ooh, but I'm thinking like, and like we're so disconnected to like our roots, our ancestral roots, and the fact, and the you saying that arts and like the Janelle Monáe's and the Erykah Badu's.
What I'm really saying is, and I think I tried to articulate it in the talk, is because I was kind of rushed at the end with all the things that probably was like the meat and bones of it, but it's the fact that the writer engages with the past, the artist engages with the past forms, the dancer engages with past forms. Technology is not asked to do that. We just don't ask it to do that. It's always about that future. It's look forward. What's next? That's really what I'm questioning. Of like, why do we do that? Is there room to stop doing that? And I don't have an answer, but what would it look like?
How upset are we supposed to be about a technology?
I didn't ask it.
I think we're gonna finish.
I'm meaning that like it's as imperfect with this as it is with making fingers.
Yeah.
Yeah, lots of things. I'm gonna finish up.
And I don't think we have to be upset. It's more like, do we even think about it?
No, okay, finish asking your question.
Fail on me. So on this like double consciousness issue, like an observation as well, like I've kind of given up on ChatGPT and all them guys, because it's the same thing when you put
something in.
Well, you put like any black thing, it comes up like Transformers. It always goes back to justice and it always wants us to see what like. So it's creating this image of like that's the only language of blackness.
According to ChatGPT, to be black is to only be engaged in a struggle narrative.
Thank you for the language, because I noticed it on my own, and it's like that's
just Google anything black and it'll be like, well, the politics that they were engaged in
every time
and anti-black racism. That's it. And so think about the younger children using that. They're only going to see black people through that prism. But I'm sure my colleague over there will say, well, is that new?
But that is my question.
But that's what you would say. But you would say, is that new? Hasn't it been doing that in other forms? Maybe it has, but I think, to me, it's the question of, do we at least acknowledge that it's happening in technology, and can we trace it? Like, I just think we need to historicize technology more. That's really the argument. The argument is not why or where do we start. It's just the act of historicizing is really what I'm getting at. And then I personally think through art, literature, dance, those are ways to think about how that historicizing can happen. That's really at the core of what I'm saying, not whether you do it or don't do it.
Okay, I think we have time for a few more questions.
Okay, last question.
Hopefully very
Make it a
brief.
good one.
It's about the algorithm. I understood what you said about looking at the back end, that's where the solution is. But do you have a solution about the algorithm part of it? Because that picture there, the lady with the two pictures, it's an algorithm issue. It's not the front end.
Yeah,
it's what happens behind. And I get where you're going with that, and I agree with you. But how do we deal with that back end, which is invisible to us?
That is the question. How do we deal with that back end? And first, we don't know how that back end works. I can't actually answer your question, right? I don't know. Is that still ARPANET? Although that was decommissioned in 1990. Is there something else with the Department of Defense working with some of these Silicon Valley companies? And what about the Waterloo region? I didn't even have time to get into that. There are a lot of tech companies in the Waterloo region. What are they also building? Like, what I'm really trying to implore people to understand is to simply ask the question. I don't have the answer. It's the fact that we don't ask the question. Like, we actually don't say, we almost have a defeatist, well, it was just the algorithm. But who, like who? Who created this? Where is it coming from? And to your point, do we actually have agency to know, to be engaged in a conversation? I don't even know if I have the agency to do that. Like, I don't even know if that would just be stopped at some customer service level and say, we are not at liberty to give you this information. I have no idea. And so there's at the same time, and this is what I'll end with, I think at the same time through, I hope what you got from my talk, technology has fundamentally changed the world. It has allowed us to connect and do things that we never would have been able to do. But I actually think the duality of it is that it's also created, it's also disempowered us in many ways from sources of information that in the analog era we could probably access. In the digital era, you just can't access it. I actually don't know. I can't answer your question. And I think some people would say, but does it matter? Why do you need to know that? Look at what I can now do with this technology. So some people would say the answer to your question is to create like black algorithms, or like to create algorithms that are more positive, or whatever the word is. But the problem is with that is the algorithm is infinite. You actually don't know where it's going to go. So whatever you think you can control, it's going to end up controlling you. So I think, you know, part of, you know, what I hope people get from this is to maybe not think so much in the present tense about that, but maybe go back to the past and think about the origin of the algorithm itself, and where it was situated in, and maybe the ways in which it's been taken up in the culture, and find ways to make sense of it, maybe not to answer the larger question that you're asking, because I don't know if there is an answer. Not to end on a dystopic kind of note.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for such an engaging Q&A. I think dinner will be really exciting after this.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you all being here, truly. And I'm sorry to have kept you 5 minutes over.
It was so terrible. How dare you? Thank you all so much for attending. Our next lecture series will actually be on December 9th. So same place. If you're interested in coming, it'll be a very interesting talk about the pseudoscience of the Black athlete, which I think will be very engaging. And then Dominique handed me this little slip of paper because we do have, for an attendance award, a free Ingenia membership to all 3 of our museums. And that's going to Sally Lafferty, but I think Sally's online right now, so yes, thank you, Sally. Asked the question, got a reward.